The morning sunlight filtered through the classroom windows as Miss Henderson watched Emma sit alone in the reading corner, her small legs folded beneath her like she was trying to make herself invisible. The other children played with colorful building blocks, their laughter filling the room with the kind of joy that should have been contagious for any 3-year-old. But Emma didn't look up. She never did anymore. Her focus remained fixed on the worn pages of a picture book she'd looked at 100 times before, though she couldn't read a single word. Ms. Henderson had been teaching preschool for 22 years, long enough to recognize the subtle signs that something was deeply wrong. It wasn't one dramatic moment that alarmed her. It was the accumulation of small, seemingly insignificant details that painted a troubling portrait. Emma flinched when doors closed suddenly. She cried at unexpected loud noises. She wore long sleeves even during the warmth of late spring, when the other children played in t-shirts and shorts. When Miss Henderson gently suggested to Emma's mother that lighter clothing might be more comfortable, the woman's jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly. But it was the bruises that truly frightened Miss Henderson. Dark purple and green marks occasionally appeared on Emma's arms and legs, marks that looked suspiciously like handprints. 3 weeks earlier, during bathroom time, Emma had changed into her spare clothes kept at school. As the little girl pulled off her shirt, Miss Henderson glimpsed several bruises running along her small ribs. When she'd asked Emma what happened, the child had simply gone silent, her eyes filling with tears that rolled down her cheeks without a sound. She wouldn't speak, wouldn't explain, just stared at the floor until Miss Henderson finished helping her dress. That night, Miss Henderson had called her director and reported her concerns. The following day, an incident report was filed with the county social services department. The machinery of child protection, though well-intentioned, often moved slowly. Days turned into weeks. Emma's father, Michael, came to pick her up from school one afternoon and barely acknowledged his daughter's existence. He'd grabbed her backpack, signed her out without looking at the clipboard, and hurried her toward a beat-up sedan parked at the curb. Emma had moved mechanically, like a small robot programmed with predetermined motions. She didn't wave goodbye to Miss Henderson. She didn't smile. She didn't do anything that 3-year-olds were supposed to do. She simply disappeared into the car and was gone. That same week, Emma's mother came for pickup, and Miss Henderson noticed she had a fresh bruise on her own arm, a dark spot she attempted to cover with makeup but couldn't quite conceal. When Miss Henderson asked if everything was okay at home, his face had closed off completely. She'd forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said everything was fine, just fine. Emma was being difficult lately, a handful really, but nothing to worry about. The tension radiating from the woman suggested otherwise. There was fear underlying her words, fear so palpable that Ms. Henderson could taste it. Social worker Jennifer Martinez received the referral on a Tuesday morning. She'd been in Child Protective Services for 8 years, had conducted hundreds of home investigations, had seen the worst of what people could do to their own children. She approached each case with both skepticism and hope. Skepticism because she'd learned that not every bruise meant abuse, but hope because sometimes early intervention literally saved lives. She scheduled her first visit to the house on Maple Street for the following Thursday afternoon. The home itself appeared deceptively normal. The lawn was maintained, the house painted a neutral beige, curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. Inside, toys were scattered about, though organized enough to suggest some attempt at cleanliness. There were drawings on the refrigerator, childlike stick figures and colorful scribbles. A half-eaten container of yogurt sat on the kitchen counter. Everything looked like a typical home with a young child. But as Jennifer toured the rooms with Michael, and she noticed the absence of warmth. There were no family photos on the walls. No evidence of parental affection displayed anywhere. The kitchen cabinets held minimal food, mostly cereal and ramen noodles. The refrigerator contained virtually no fresh produce or milk. When Jennifer asked to see Emma, the girl had been brought from the bedroom where she'd apparently been napping. The child looked at Jennifer with eyes that seemed to carry a burden far too heavy for someone so small. Emma wore long sleeves despite the warmth inside the house. When Jennifer attempted to engage her in conversation, asking her simple questions about her favorite colors and toys, Emma gave only one-word answers delivered in barely audible whispers. She wouldn't make eye contact. She wouldn't smile. She clung to her mother's leg like a frightened animal, though when shifted her position, Emma flinched slightly, a nearly imperceptible movement that Jennifer caught because she was trained to catch such things. Jennifer's instincts screamed danger, but her experience also told her that intuition wasn't sufficient evidence. She would need documentation, patterns, physical evidence. She asked about the bruises and claimed Emma was clumsy, always running into things, typical toddler accidents. Michael remained silent throughout most of the conversation, offering minimal engagement, occasionally exchanging looks with that Jennifer couldn't quite interpret. Were they looks of concern, coordination, conspiracy? Jennifer couldn't be certain, though her gut told her something sinister was happening behind closed doors. Over the following weeks, Jennifer conducted 2 more home visits. Each time she noticed more concerning details. Emma seemed more withdrawn, if that was even possible. During the 3rd visit, Jennifer attempted to examine Emma's arms more carefully, suggesting the child might enjoy a game where they could compare their freckles and marks. Emma had pulled away, genuine terror flashing across her face. Michael had stepped between them, his tone becoming sharp and aggressive. He said Emma was fine. There was nothing wrong with her. Jennifer was overstepping, and they didn't appreciate being treated like criminals. Had said nothing, just stared at her feet with an expression of deep sadness mixed with resignation. That evening, Jennifer submitted a report noting suspected child abuse, but without more concrete evidence, without a child willing to speak, without photographs of clear injuries, without medical documentation. The case remained in a frustrating limbo. The law required proof. Intent had to be demonstrated. Silence, it seemed, protected the guilty more effectively than any lawyer's argument ever could. Emma's silence was both a shield and a weapon, shielding her abusers from prosecution while simultaneously wounding herself through her voicelessness. A small child caught in a legal system that moved too slowly and required evidence that the victim was too terrified to provide. Detective sat in his cramped office at the county prosecutor's building, the walls covered with case files, photographs, and handwritten notes that he'd accumulated over 18 years of law enforcement. The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous song, casting everything in a sickly pallor. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, the surface now a thin film of congealed cream and bitterness. Through the small window beside his desk, he could see the courthouse parking lot, where people came seeking justice and often left disappointed by the glacial pace of the system. He'd been staring at the Emma file for 3 days straight. Jennifer Martinez's reports were meticulously detailed, professional, and deeply troubling. The photographs of the home showed a child living in conditions that suggested neglect at minimum and abuse at worst. The medical examination had revealed behavioral indicators consistent with severe trauma, post-traumatic stress responses that typically appeared in children who'd experienced violence or sexual abuse. Yet the prosecuting attorney had made it clear, without a statement from the child, without direct testimony about what had actually happened behind closed doors, they couldn't move forward with charges that would survive a courtroom challenge. "We need the kid to talk," the prosecutor, David, had said bluntly during their morning briefing. "And right now, she's not talking. She's terrified. Hell, I don't blame her. The system that's supposed to protect her has probably traumatized her further by now." Had felt that familiar frustration building in his chest, the feeling that rose whenever he encountered the rigid limitations of the legal system. He'd worked dozens of child abuse cases. He knew the statistics. Approximately 1 in 4 girls experienced severe physical or sexual abuse during childhood, yet only a fraction of these cases resulted in prosecution. The reasons were always the same: fear, shame, lack of evidence, children too young to articulate what had happened, victims who'd been programmed by their abusers to remain silent. That evening had gone home to his small apartment and couldn't sleep. He'd paced his living room, thinking about Emma, thinking about the countless other children suffering in silence while the system fumbled with procedures and regulations. Around 2 a.m., unable to sleep, he turned on his computer and started researching. He typed keywords into search engines: traumatized children testimony, court procedures for child witnesses, innovative approaches to child witness interviews. One article caught his attention. It discussed a pilot program in California where therapy dogs had been used to help children testify in sexual abuse cases. The results were striking. Children who with a support animal present showed increased disclosure rates and experienced fewer acute trauma symptoms during the testimony process. The dogs weren't there as gimmicks. They were trained professionals, specially certified in victim support. They didn't perform tricks or provide entertainment. They provided presence, a tangible connection to safety that the courtroom environment couldn't otherwise offer. Red until dawn broke through his apartment windows. By the time he showered and dressed for work, he'd already mapped out a strategy. He spent the entire morning gathering research, studies, case precedents, anything that could support his idea. He printed articles, highlighted key passages, and organized them into a compelling presentation. His colleagues thought he'd lost his mind when they saw him carrying the stack of papers to Judge Chambers. Judge was a woman in her mid-60s who'd spent 32 years in the judicial system. She'd heard nearly everything and been surprised by precious little. When entered her chambers and began explaining his proposal, she listened with the expression of someone humoring a colleague while secretly wondering about his mental health. "A therapy dog in the courtroom," she'd repeated, her eyebrows climbing toward her hairline. "Detective, I appreciate your passion about this case, but we have procedures. We have rules of evidence. We can't just turn my courtroom into a petting zoo." "It's not a petting zoo," had said, his voice steady and earnest. "It's a trauma-informed approach to facilitating child testimony. Your Honor, I've researched this extensively. There are peer-reviewed studies. There are successful implementations in multiple states. The dog doesn't testify. The dog doesn't provide evidence. The dog provides psychological support that allows a traumatized child to access her own memories and communicate them." Judge had set down her pen and folded her hands on her desk. "Walk me through this, detective, and make it convincing, because the defense attorney is going to have a field day if I allow this." Had spent the next hour laying out his case. He discussed the neurobiology of trauma, how extreme fear literally disrupts the brain's ability to form and access memories. He'd explained that children who felt safe were more likely to communicate accurately than children who remained in a state of terror. He'd presented data from the California program showing that children interviewed with support animals disclosed more details about their abuse and experienced less re-traumatization during the process. He discussed how traditional courtroom procedures, designed by and for adults, often seemed deliberately designed to terrify children into silence. "Emma is 3 years old," had concluded. "She's already terrified. The courtroom, the strangers, the formal procedures, they all reinforce her conditioning that speaking up is dangerous. If we can provide an element that signals safety to her unconscious mind, we increase the likelihood that she'll be able to speak her truth. And Your Honor, in my 18 years doing this job, I've learned that a child's truth, spoken from a place of safety, carries more weight than silence ever could." Judge had been quiet for a long time after that. She'd stared out her window at the courthouse grounds, her fingers tapping against her desk in a steady rhythm. When she'd finally looked back there was something different in her expression, a recognition of the impossible position they were all in, and a willingness to try something unconventional if it might help. "You'll need to find a certified handler and a trained dog," she'd said finally. "Properly certified. We can't have just any dog in my courtroom. This has to be done right by the book so that any conviction stands up to appeal." "I know someone," had said immediately. "Officer runs our county's K-9 unit. He's trained in victim support protocols. I worked with him on a case 3 years ago. He's exactly what we need." And just like that, the impossible became possible. The desperate gamble had official sanction. The question now was whether a small child's trauma could be overcome by the simple presence of a gentle dog, and whether justice could finally reach into the silence and pull out the truth that waited there, terrified and voiceless, in Emma's broken little heart. The clock on the courthouse wall read 7:47 a.m. when Emma's grandmother gripped her granddaughter's small hand and climbed the marble steps that led into the building. Was 68 years old, a retired nurse with silver hair and the kind of face that had weathered life's storms with grace and determination. She'd raised 3 children of her own, and now she was raising her granddaughter in the wreckage left behind by Emma's parents. The elderly woman's jaw was set firm, her spine straight despite the weight she carried, the weight of Emma's trauma, the responsibility of protecting her, and the burden of hope that today might finally bring justice. Emma wore a pink dress with white socks and small black shoes that were still uncomfortably stiff, purchased just days ago from a discount store. Had let her pick it out, believing that having some control over at least one aspect of this day might help. The dress hung on Emma's small frame like it was made for a larger child. She'd lost weight over the past months, anxiety robbing her of appetite, trauma stealing her childhood curves and replacing them with a fragility that made her look even younger than 3. The child walked mechanically, her hand limp in her grandmother's grip. She clutched a stuffed rabbit in her other hand, a toy with matted gray fur and one eye hanging by a thread. The rabbit had been a gift from, and it had become Emma's comfort object, something she carried everywhere, something that represented unconditional gentleness in a world that had shown her only cruelty. Emma's eyes were fixed on the ground, watching the courthouse tiles blur beneath her feet. Her breathing was shallow, her small chest rising and falling in rapid, anxious patterns. Knelt down before they entered the courtroom, bringing her face level with Emma's. "My sweet girl," she whispered, brushing a strand of honey-colored hair from Emma's forehead. "I know you're scared. I know this is hard, but you're so brave and I'm so proud of you. You're not alone today. I'm here. And there's a nice man and a nice dog who are going to help keep you safe. Can you remember that?" Emma nodded slightly, but her eyes remained hollow, reflecting none of the usual sparkle of childhood. His heart broke a little more, as it did every single day since she'd learned the truth about what had been happening to her granddaughter. She'd spent 50 years nursing patients through their darkest hours, but nothing in her professional experience had prepared her for the pain of watching her granddaughter suffer at the hands of the people who were supposed to love and protect her most. Inside the courthouse, the special courtroom designated for sensitive cases had been transformed. Gone were the harsh fluorescent overhead lights that characterized most of the building. Soft lighting had been installed, creating an almost gentle atmosphere. The witness stand had been modified. Instead of the typical elevated platform that would tower over a child's perspective, a small chair had been placed at a height where a 3-year-old could sit without feeling dwarfed by the surroundings. Colorful cushions in soft blues and greens adorned the furniture. A small table held crayons and paper, though no one expected Emma would be drawing today. Everything had been designed with one purpose: to make this space feel less like a courtroom and more like a safe room. Sarah Mitchell, the court-appointed child advocate, had arrived 45 minutes early. She was a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and a demeanor that children naturally gravitated toward. She'd spent 6 weeks building a relationship with Emma through play therapy and gentle conversation. Sarah understood that her role wasn't to interrogate or pressure. It was to create a bridge between Emma's traumatized mind and the truth that lived somewhere deep inside her. She'd brought toys, stuffed animals, building blocks, picture books, anything that might help establish a sense of safety and normalcy. Sarah reviewed her notes one final time, her hands steady despite the tension coursing through her body. She'd done this before, worked with traumatized children in court proceedings, but each case carried its own weight, its own gravity. Emma was particularly broken, particularly silent. Sarah knew the odds. She knew that even with all the preparations, all the compassion in the world, Emma might not speak. She might sit in that chair and say nothing, paralyzed by fear. And then the men who'd hurt her would walk free, because the legal system required proof that the victim was too terrified to provide. Across the courthouse, in the building's opposite wing, the defendant sat in a holding cell. Michael Thornton, Emma's father, was a lean man with cold eyes and a permanent expression of contempt. He'd maintained his innocence throughout the entire investigation, denying everything, claiming Emma was a troubled child prone to lying and confusion. His lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named, had coached him extensively on his courtroom demeanor. "Look sympathetic," she'd instructed. "Look confused by the accusations. Act like a concerned father who's been falsely accused." Thornton, Emma's mother, sat beside her husband in a state of barely contained anxiety. Unlike Michael's cold detachment, radiated nervous energy. She chain-chewed gum, bounced her leg, bit at her cuticles until they bled. She knew what Emma might say. She knew because she'd witnessed things, had enabled things, had chosen her husband's protection over her daughter's safety. The weight of her complicity was written across her face in lines of exhaustion and despair. Her lawyer had told her not to speak, not to make eye contact, to let the legal process unfold, but knew that today, that advice might not be enough to save her from the consequences of her choices. Judge sat in her chambers reviewing case files and research materials. She'd spent the previous evening reading everything had given her about trauma-informed approaches to child testimony. She'd spoken with Officer by phone, assessing his qualifications and his understanding of the protocols they'd be implementing. The judge was risking her reputation on this decision. If it failed, if Emma remained silent, if the prosecution couldn't make its case, there would be questions about her judgment, about whether she'd allowed her emotions to override legal procedure. But if it succeeded, if a 3-year-old found her voice because of the presence of a gentle dog, then maybe the system could finally evolve. At 8:30 a.m., Officer walked Duke through the courthouse corridors toward the special courtroom. The German Shepherd moved with calm purpose, his brown eyes alert and intelligent. Officer had spent hours preparing Duke for this moment, reviewing protocols, ensuring the dog understood that this was a victim support assignment, not an investigation or apprehension scenario. Duke had been specifically trained for this work, had helped other traumatized children find their voices. Officer believed in the mission, with the kind of quiet certainty that comes from witnessing the impossible become real. By 9:00 a.m., everyone was in place. The courtroom was ready. The judge was ready. The prosecution was ready. The defense was ready. But in a small waiting room down the hall, a 3-year-old girl with a stuffed rabbit and a heart full of terror sat beside her grandmother, waiting to discover if she could finally find the courage to speak the truth that had been imprisoned inside her for so long. Sarah Mitchell stood at the courtroom entrance, her hand resting gently on the door frame, watching Emma and approach down the hallway. She could see the tension radiating from both of them, the elderly woman's protective grip, the young child's mechanical steps, the stuffed rabbit clutched like a lifeline. Sarah had worked with traumatized children for 15 years, and she'd learned to read the language of trauma written across their bodies. Emma's trauma was screaming silently from every rigid muscle, every downward glance, every shallow breath. "Emma, honey," Sarah said softly, crouching down to the child's eye level. "We're going to go into a special room now. It's a room just for you, and there's someone I want you to meet. Would that be okay?" Emma didn't respond verbally, but she looked at Sarah for a moment, a brief flicker of eye contact that was already an improvement from their earlier sessions. The child's hand remained locked in her grandmother's grip, her other hand crushing the stuffed rabbit with surprising force. Squeezed her granddaughter's shoulder gently. "It's okay, sweetheart. Go with Miss Sarah. I'll be right here if you need me." Sarah led Emma into the courtroom, and the child's eyes widened slightly at the unfamiliar space. Despite the warm lighting and soft cushions, a courtroom was still a courtroom, a place where serious things happened, where authority figures sat in positions of power. Emma's breathing became even more shallow. She looked like she might bolt at any moment, reverting to the fight-or-flight response that trauma had etched into her nervous system. "Emma," Sarah said, her voice low and soothing, "I have someone I think you're going to like meeting. His name is Duke, and he's a very special friend. Would you like to say hello to him?" Before Emma could answer, Officer emerged from a side door, Duke walking quietly at his side. The German shepherd moved with the calm grace of a dog who understood the weight of his purpose. His brown eyes were gentle, his demeanor completely relaxed despite the unfamiliar environment. Officer kept Duke on a short leash, moving slowly, deliberately, allowing Emma time to process what she was seeing. Emma froze. Her grip on the stuffed rabbit loosened slightly. For the first time since entering the building, something in her expression shifted. It wasn't joy exactly, but it was recognition. The recognition of another being that didn't radiate authority or danger, that moved without aggression, that simply existed in a state of calm presence. "This is Duke," Officer said, his voice equally calm and measured. "He's a very good friend. Would you like to pet him?" Emma didn't respond, but she took a small step forward. Sarah remained close, a steady presence at Emma's back, not pushing but gently supporting. Officer knelt down, bringing himself and Duke closer to the child's eye level. He didn't force interaction. He simply existed beside Emma, allowing her to make the choice about proximity and contact. Emma reached out one trembling hand. Her small fingers, still curled from the tension in her body, extended toward Duke's fur. When her skin made contact with the dog's coat, something visible shifted in Emma's physiology. Her shoulders dropped slightly. Her breathing deepened. The white-knuckled grip she'd maintained on her stuffed rabbit loosened to a more normal hold. Duke remained perfectly still. Officer had trained him extensively for this exact moment, the critical instant when a traumatized child needed to feel absolute safety. The dog didn't jump, didn't lick, didn't perform any excited greeting behaviors. He simply allowed himself to be touched, to be explored, to be the anchoring point for Emma's overwhelming anxiety. "You can pet him," Sarah encouraged softly. "Duke likes being petted. He's a very good boy." Emma's hand began moving, stroking Duke's fur in slow, repetitive motions. With each stroke, more tension seemed to leave her small body. She was still afraid. That hadn't disappeared, but the acute panic was diminishing, being replaced by something more manageable, something that allowed her nervous system to begin shifting from crisis mode toward something approaching stability. Sarah sat down on the colorful cushion beside Emma, maintaining a physical proximity that communicated support without crowding the child. Officer remained kneeling, his presence steady and reassuring, his hand occasionally touching Duke's neck, creating a circuit of calm energy, handler to dog to child. "Emma," Sarah said very gently after several minutes had passed, "Duke is here to help you today. He helps people tell their truths. Sometimes when we've been scared, it's hard to talk about it, but Duke is a friend and friends help each other. Do you understand?" Emma continued petting Duke, but now she nodded, a small movement of her head that registered acknowledgement. "Today, some people are going to ask you some questions," Sarah continued. "They might ask you about things that made you sad. They might ask you about things that hurt. You don't have to answer if you don't want to, but if you do answer, I'll be here. Miss will be close by, and Duke will be here too. All of us are here to help keep you safe." Emma looked up at Sarah for a moment, her eyes still carrying the weight of her trauma, but also something new, something that looked like the faintest glimmer of trust. She looked back at Duke and resumed her gentle stroking. The prosecutor, Lisa Martinez, had been watching from the side of the courtroom. She felt tears burning in her eyes as she witnessed this simple interaction. A child beginning to find safety through connection with an animal that asked nothing of her except her own willingness to be present. In 15 years of prosecuting abuse cases, Lisa had rarely seen a child this traumatized begin to show signs of engagement this quickly. "Can we begin?" Judge asked quietly from the bench. She'd been observing the interaction as well, noting how Emma's body language had transformed in the span of just a few minutes. Sarah nodded and looked at Emma. "Emma, the judge would like to talk with you now. I'll be right here, okay? And Duke will be here too." Emma looked terrified again, but she also looked different than she had an hour ago. She looked like a child who'd been given permission to feel safe in an unsafe world. She nodded, and as she did, her hand continued its rhythmic stroking of Duke's fur, the golden thread connecting her to another being, a being that represented safety, compassion, and the possibility that adults could be trusted to protect rather than harm. Officer remained positioned beside Emma throughout, Duke's calm presence creating a buffer between the child and the formal machinery of justice. As the prosecutor began asking her gentle questions, Emma's whispered responses started coming, fragmented, halting, but real. With each word, the weight she'd been carrying seemed to shift slightly. Duke's presence wasn't magic, but it was something almost as powerful. It was permission for a traumatized child to finally begin speaking her truth. The courtroom had settled into a strange, expectant silence. Judge sat on the bench, her reading glasses positioned on the bridge of her nose, her expression carefully neutral despite the racing thoughts behind her eyes. She'd made an unconventional decision in approving the K-9 presence, and now the moment of truth had arrived. Everything depended on what happened in the next few minutes: a child's ability to speak, a system's willingness to listen, and the possibility that justice could reach even the smallest, most vulnerable victims. Emma sat on the cushioned chair, Duke positioned beside her, the dog's warm body a constant comfort against her small leg. Sarah Mitchell remained close, her notebook open but her focus entirely on Emma's rather than documentation. Prosecutor Lisa Martinez stood at the podium, her hands trembling slightly despite years of courtroom experience. She'd prepared this moment meticulously, crafting questions that were open-ended, non-leading, and designed to allow Emma to access her own memories rather than suggesting answers. "Emma," Lisa began, her voice gentle and warm, "thank you for being so brave today. I know this is a hard place, and I know you might be feeling scared. But I want you to know that everyone in this room cares about you and wants to help keep you safe. Can you understand that?" Emma nodded slightly, her small hand still resting on Duke's fur. The dog turned his head slightly, as if offering reassurance that everything would be okay. "I'm going to ask you some questions, Emma, and if you don't want to answer, that's okay. You can just say, 'I don't know,' or you can say, 'No.' Does that make sense?" Another small nod. Emma's breathing had become more regular, more stable than it had been throughout the entire morning. The rhythm of her hand on Duke's coat continued, stroke, 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 a meditative repetition that kept her grounded in the present moment. "Emma, do you live with your mommy and daddy?" "Yes," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible even in the quiet courtroom. The court reporter leaned forward slightly to ensure she captured the response. "And who else lives in your house?" "My big sister," Emma said, slightly louder this time. "She in her room a lot." Lisa nodded, allowing Emma time to process each question before moving forward. She was building a foundation, establishing Emma's as a witness, creating a narrative thread that would lead inevitably toward the truth. "Emma, sometimes mommies and daddies do things that make children feel sad or hurt. Has anyone ever done something that made you feel sad or hurt?" The question hung in the air like a suspended weight. Emma's hand stilled on Duke's fur. Her entire body seemed to tense, her breathing becoming shallow again. Lisa could see the internal struggle playing out across the child's face, the battle between speaking and staying silent, between safety and the conditioning she'd received to protect her abusers through her silence. "It's okay to tell," Lisa said gently. "You're safe here. Can you tell me what happened?" Emma looked at Duke, and the dog's calm brown eyes seemed to communicate something wordless but powerful. The child's hand resumed its stroking motion. "My daddy," Emma began, her voice trembling, he hurt me. He put his hands." She trailed off, unable or unwilling to continue with specific details. But the implication was clear. The courtroom seemed to stop breathing. The defense attorney shifted in her seat, preparing to object to challenge to protect her clients. But Judge raised her hand slightly, gesturing for her to wait. "Where did he hurt you?" Lisa asked. "Everywhere," Emma whispered. He say if I tell anybody he take my toys. He say nobody believe me. He say I'm bad girl." The prosecutor's chest tightened. She'd heard these exact statements before. The abuser's script designed to silence, to shame, to make the victim complicit in their own victimization. "Emma, I need to ask you something very important, and I want you to look around the room and tell me if you can see your daddy here. Can you do that?" This was the critical moment. Lisa had prepared for it, had discussed it extensively with Sarah and Officer. Emma needed to identify her abuser directly, needed to point to him in the courtroom. This wasn't hearsay. This was a child's direct accusation, made in front of witnesses and under the weight of her oath to tell the truth. Emma's body went rigid. Her hand gripped Duke's fur so tightly the dog shifted slightly, but remarkably remained calm. Emma's eyes scanned the courtroom slowly, taking in the judge, the prosecutors, the court reporters, and then her gaze landed on the defense table where Michael and Thornton sat. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Emma's arm extended from beneath the table, trembling visibly. Her small index finger pointed directly at her father, Michael Thornton. The man's face paled. His attorney immediately reached over and touched his arm, whispering something urgently. And then came the words that would echo through the courthouse hallways, through news reports, through law enforcement training programs across the country. Words delivered in the halting, fragmented speech of a traumatized 3-year-old, but words that carried the undeniable weight of truth. That man is mean. He tell me to stay quiet or Duke go away." The courtroom erupted. Photographers outside had been waiting for hours, but no one had anticipated this level of drama. The defense attorney was on her feet, objecting strenuously. Michael Thornton's face had gone white, and he was shaking his head frantically, denying everything, his mouth moving in silent protest. Thornton had her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Judge gavelled loudly, demanding order. "We will have order in this courtroom." Sarah had moved to Emma immediately, wrapping a protective arm around the child. Duke pressed against Emma's other side, as if shielding her from the chaos erupting around them. The little girl looked terrified, but also something else, relieved perhaps, that the secret she'd been forced to carry was finally released into the world. "That's enough," Judge commanded, her voice cutting through the noise like steel. "Emma, you're doing so well, you're so brave. We're going to take a short break now, okay?" Emma nodded, and Sarah began leading her out of the courtroom, Duke following close beside them. As they passed the defense table, Michael Thornton stared at his daughter with an expression of pure rage and shock. Emma didn't look at him. She kept her eyes forward, her hand still gripping Sarah's, her other hand reaching down occasionally to touch Duke's head. The moment was captured by news cameras. Later, when the photographs were released, they would show a tiny child in a pink dress, a therapy dog at her side, walking away from a courtroom where she just shattered months of silence and named her abuser. The image would become iconic, a symbol of courage, of truth, of a child's voice finally being heard. In the hallway, Emma collapsed against her grandmother, tears streaming down her face, held her granddaughter, rocking her gently, whispering words of love and safety. Officer stood nearby with Duke, both of them watching the reunion with quiet satisfaction. They'd done it. Against all odds, in the face of a system designed to protect the guilty as much as the innocent, a 3-year-old had found her voice. And that voice had power. That voice had changed everything. By 2 p.m. that same day, news helicopters were circling the courthouse. Local television stations had broken into afternoon programming with special reports. The headline was irresistible: 3-year-old identifies abuser with help of therapy dog. Within hours, the story had gone national. By evening, it was trending on every social media platform. Emma's case had become something larger than a single prosecution. It had become a symbol, a movement, a wake-up call to a legal system that desperately needed transformation. Detective sat in his office, watching his phone light up with incoming calls and messages. Prosecutors from California wanted details. A judge from New York was requesting documentation about the K-9 protocol. A university researcher in Boston sent an email asking about conducting a longitudinal study on the case's outcomes. News outlets requested interviews. Speaking engagements were being offered. Within 24 hours, had received more professional inquiries than he typically received in an entire year. He'd expected some attention. He hadn't expected this. At 6 p.m., his office phone rang. It was a producer from a national news network requesting a satellite interview. At 7 p.m., a law school dean called asking if would be willing to serve as a guest lecturer. By 8 p.m., had declined all but one interview, a careful, serious piece with a respected news correspondent who promised to approach the story thoughtfully rather than sensationalizing it. "This isn't about me," told the producer. "This is about a child's courage and the necessity for systemic change. If we're going to do this story, we need to tell it right." Officer was experiencing his own version of the media phenomenon. His K-9 unit, which had previously operated in relative obscurity, was suddenly fielding calls from police departments across the country. The Kansas City Police Department wanted to know about starting their own victim support dog program. The Los Angeles Sheriff's Department requested training protocols. A prestigious dog training facility in Colorado offered to send instructors to train their handlers pro. Duke, who'd been a good dog doing important work in the shadows, was suddenly becoming famous. But the most significant changes were happening at the systemic level. 3 days after Emma's testimony, the state attorney general's office called an emergency meeting to discuss implementing trauma-informed procedures statewide. Judges began reaching out to their colleagues, asking about K-9 protocols and whether their courthouses might benefit from similar programs. The governor's office contacted Judge directly, expressing interest in making this the model for the state. By the end of the first week, 16 other courts in the state had begun exploring similar programs. By the end of the month, 37 courts across 12 states had officially adopted what became known as the Emma Protocol, a comprehensive approach that combined trained victim support animals with trauma-informed interview techniques and specially designed courtroom environments. Academic researchers descended on the case like bees to honey. Child psychology professors analyzed Emma's responses and behavior shifts. Neuroscientists reviewed the case through the lens of trauma-informed neurobiology. Law school professors wrote about the legal precedents and implications. Within 3 months, there were more than 50 peer-reviewed articles and research papers being developed that referenced Emma's testimony. A prominent legal journal published a comprehensive study conducted by Detective and a team of research psychologists examining outcomes from the Emma Protocol compared to traditional child testimony procedures. The results were striking. Children interviewed with support animals showed 73% higher rates of disclosure, experienced significantly fewer acute trauma symptoms during testimony, and displayed better long-term psychological outcomes. The data was compelling, undeniable, and revolutionizing. The case attracted philanthropic attention as well. A major foundation dedicated to child advocacy reached out to Judge, offering to fund victim support animal programs across multiple states. A tech billionaire who'd survived childhood abuse himself pledged $10 million to expand K-9 trauma therapy training programs nationwide. The financial barriers that had previously limited implementation suddenly crumbled. But perhaps the most significant impact came from within the legal system itself. The National Association of Judges held an emergency forum discussing the Emma Protocol. The American Bar Association began drafting recommendations for trauma-informed procedures in child witness cases. Law enforcement training academies started including modules on victim support animals in their standard curricula. The system that had previously moved with glacial slowness suddenly recognized an urgent necessity for change. News outlets continued covering the story for weeks. Emma's face, though carefully protected by media guidelines limiting identification of minor victims, became symbolic of child resilience. Illustrations and artistic renderings depicted a small child with a gentle dog, a universal image representing the intersection of vulnerability and protection. Dr. Sarah, a prominent child psychologist and trauma expert, gave a TED Talk about Emma's case. She discussed how the simple act of providing safety and support could unlock a child's ability to access her own truth. The talk went viral, reaching millions of viewers. In the comments section, parents, teachers, social workers, and advocates shared their own stories of children struggling to disclose abuse, of the barriers they'd encountered, of how they wished resources like the Emma Protocol had existed for their own experiences. Detective published his research findings in a book titled The Voice That Changed Justice: How One Child's Courage Transformed the Legal System. The book became a bestseller, required reading in law schools and police training academies, gave lectures at universities across the country, always beginning with the same statement: "This isn't about me. This is about recognizing that the most powerful truths often come from the smallest voices." Officer and Duke were featured in a documentary about trauma-informed approaches to criminal justice. The film premiered at a prestigious film festival and was later acquired by a major streaming platform, reaching an international audience. Dog training programs received record numbers of applications from handlers wanting to specialize in victim support work. But amid all the attention and systemic change, there was something bittersweet in the recognition. Emma's case had catalyzed transformation because it was compelling, because it involved a sympathetic victim and an innovative solution. But the harsh reality was that for every Emma whose case received attention, hundreds of other traumatized children remained silent, their abuse undisclosed, their voices unheard. The case became a rallying cry for advocates pushing for expanded victim services, increased funding for child protection agencies, and better training for professionals working with traumatized children. Policy makers who'd previously resisted funding for these services suddenly found political will to support them. Budgets were increased, programs were expanded, resources were allocated. By the end of the year, more than 100 courts across the country had implemented some version of the Emma Protocol. The training programs had expanded to multiple states. Dozens of new K-9 victim support units had been established. The ripples from Emma's small, trembling voice had become waves of change washing across the entire system. Judge received dozens of requests to speak at conferences. She accepted only a few, carefully selecting venues where she could discuss not just the legal innovation but the human element, the reality of a traumatized child whose courage had sparked change. In every speech, she made the same point: "We didn't create anything new here. We simply recognized that justice requires meeting people, especially vulnerable people, where they are. We created safety, and safety allowed truth to emerge." Emma didn't understand the scope of what she'd done, but the world was beginning to understand. One child's courage had changed the landscape of American justice, and as more courtrooms implemented trauma-informed procedures, more children would find their voices. More abusers would be held accountable. More justice would be served to the smallest, most vulnerable members of society. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. 6 hours of agonizing uncertainty, 6 hours during which Emma's fate hung suspended between justice and failure. Sat in the courthouse hallway, her daughter beside her, both women silent with the weight of waiting. Emma was in a separate room with Sarah Mitchell, coloring pictures and playing with toys, mercifully unaware of the proceedings unfolding that would determine her future safety. When the jury returned, the verdict was swift and decisive. Guilty on 7 counts of aggravated assault, 4 counts of child abuse, and 3 counts of endangerment. Michael Thornton's face crumbled as the verdicts were read, his attorney placing a hand on his shoulder as the reality of his conviction settled into place. Thornton received a separate verdict, guilty on charges of enabling abuse and criminal negligence. 23 years for Michael, 8 years for. The sentences reflected the severity of the crime and the system's recognition that this was not a case of momentary lapse but sustained, deliberate cruelty. Judge read the sentences from the bench, her voice steady and authoritative. The court finds that the defendant's actions represent a grievous violation of the trust inherent in parental relationships. The victim in this case was subjected to ongoing abuse during the most vulnerable period of her life. This court recognizes the courage demonstrated by the victim in coming forward and the innovative approaches that made her testimony possible. The sentences imposed reflect the seriousness of these crimes and the necessity of protecting vulnerable children from further harm. Emma was never brought into the courtroom for the sentencing. She didn't need to see her father's face as justice was delivered. She'd already done the hardest thing, she'd spoken her truth. The rest belonged to the system now. The transition to his home had been arranged weeks earlier in anticipation of the guilty verdict. House, a modest 2-story home in a quiet neighborhood, had been carefully prepared. Emma's bedroom featured soft pink walls decorated with images of animals and rainbows. New toys lined the shelves, age-appropriate playthings meant to encourage healing through play. Had researched trauma recovery extensively, consulting with child psychologists, and reading every book she could find about helping traumatized children heal. But knowledge and preparation, Emma's first night in her grandmother's home revealed, were not substitutes for the actual experience of witnessing a child's terror. Emma had nightmares. Every single night for the first 3 weeks she woke screaming, her small body drenched in sweat, her mind trapped in the memories of abuse. Would rush to her granddaughter's room and find her curled into a ball, trembling and sobbing. She would hold Emma, rock her, whisper words of safety and love until the child's breathing slowly regulated and she drifted back into uneasy sleep. During the day, Emma's anxiety manifested differently. She couldn't tolerate loud noises without flinching. She became rigid when unexpected sounds occurred, the doorbell, a car horn, even the normal creaks and groans of an old house settling at night. She wouldn't eat without encouragement, often pushing food away as if her body had forgotten how to accept nourishment. She clung to with an intensity that was both heartbreaking and exhausting, unable to let her grandmother out of sight without descending into panic. A child trauma specialist named Dr. Michael Torres began seeing Emma twice weekly. He was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and an office decorated to feel more like a playroom than a clinical space. Emma was completely nonverbal during the first 6 sessions, simply sitting beside Dr. Torres, occasionally making eye contact but offering no verbal responses. He didn't push. He simply provided his presence, played simple games, and allowed Emma to gradually acclimate to the idea that an adult male could exist in her space without causing harm. Attended parent training sessions conducted by a therapist specializing in trauma recovery. She learned about triggers and how to recognize them in Emma's behavior. She learned grounding techniques to help Emma return to the present moment when she became overwhelmed by memories. She learned about the neurobiology of trauma, how severe fear literally altered the structure of a child's developing brain, affecting memory formation, emotional regulation, and the ability to feel safe. Healing isn't linear, Dr. Torres told during a consultation. There will be good days and bad days. There will be progress and setbacks. Your role is consistency, patience, and unconditional love. You're essentially rewiring her nervous system, teaching her that adults can be trusted, that the world can be safe, that she's worthy of protection and care. The second month brought small victories. Emma began speaking to in fragmented sentences. She'd ask for juice or request to watch a specific show. She wouldn't engage in imaginative play yet, that would come later, but she was using words. She was communicating her basic needs. It was progress measured in the smallest increments, but it was progress nonetheless. By the third month, Emma was eating better. Her weight began to stabilize. She started playing with dolls, though her play often reflected her trauma. The dolls would hurt each other, run away, hide. Didn't intervene in this play. Research showed that allowing traumatized children to work through their experiences via play was part of the healing process. But she remained close, providing quiet support and safety. 6 months into her recovery, Emma laughed for the first time, was making funny faces and silly sounds, something she'd tried dozens of times before without success. But this time, something sparked, and Emma's face transformed with a genuine smile. The sound of her laughter, genuine, unguarded, innocent, sent tears streaming down her face. She held her granddaughter close, recognizing that this small moment of joy represented an enormous victory in Emma's journey toward healing. By the 1-year mark, Emma was sleeping through the night most nights, though occasional nightmares still awakened her. She'd begun attending preschool part-time, initially with significant anxiety but gradually acclimating to the classroom environment. She made a friend named Sophie, a girl in her class with golden curls and an infectious laugh. Would pick Emma up from school and hear excited stories about what she and Sophie had done that day. They'd built with blocks, painted pictures, sang songs. Art therapy became a significant part of Emma's healing. Where she'd once drawn dark, chaotic scribbles, she began creating pictures with color and meaning. She drew her grandmother, their house, flowers, animals. One day she drew a picture of a dog, not a representation, but a simple brown shape with 4 legs and a big smile. When asked what dog it was, Emma said simply, "My friend Duke. He helped me be brave." Framed that picture and hung it in the kitchen where Emma would see it every day. It served as a daily reminder that there were good people and good animals in the world, that courage existed, that speaking truth had been the right choice even though the process had been terrifying. 2 years after the trial, Emma was a different child, not unscathed, not without lingering effects from her trauma, but fundamentally transformed. She attended school full-time now, was doing well academically, and had developed friendships with multiple classmates. She still saw Dr. Torres occasionally, not for crisis intervention but for ongoing support and to ensure she had tools to manage the lasting effects of her early trauma. Would occasionally receive updates on her daughter's incarceration. The woman had expressed remorse, had begun attending therapy in prison, had written letters to Emma, which decided not to give to her granddaughter, preserving her right to decide when or if she wanted contact with her mother. Michael remained defiant, refusing to accept responsibility or acknowledge the harm he'd caused. But Emma didn't think about her parents often anymore. She thought about school, her friend Sophie, what was making for dinner, whether they might go to the park on Saturday. She thought about normal childhood things. The process of reclaiming her childhood had begun, one small moment of safety at a time. 8 years after Emma's testimony, the Westfield Elementary School gymnasium was packed with students, parents, teachers, and local media. The annual writing competition award ceremony was, and Emma, now 8 years old, sat in the front row with her grandmother beside her. She was smaller than many of her classmates, still bearing the physical consequences of her early malnutrition and stress, but her eyes sparkled with intelligence and resilience. Her essay, titled My Brave Day, had been selected from hundreds of entries as the district's best work of children's writing. Principal called Emma's name, and the girl walked to the podium with a mix of nervousness and quiet confidence. She was learning to navigate public attention, learning to hold her story without being defined entirely by her trauma. Watched from the audience, her heart full with pride and gratitude for how far her granddaughter had come. Emma's essay was deceptively simple in its language but profound in its meaning. She wrote about being scared, about a dog that made her feel safe, about words that got stuck in her throat and wouldn't come out until she understood that grown-ups could help. She wrote about pointing and speaking, about how hard it was to tell the truth when you were small and frightened. But she also wrote about what came after, about her grandmother's love, about therapy, about learning to laugh again, about the power of persistence and the importance of asking for help. The gymnasium fell silent as Emma read her essay. Grown adults dabbed at their eyes. Teachers wiped away tears. When Emma finished, the applause was thunderous and sustained. Emma smiled, genuinely, unguardedly, the smile of a child who'd learned to celebrate her own resilience. Across the country, the Emma Protocol had evolved from an experimental approach to standard practice. 147 courts across 32 states had officially implemented trauma-informed procedures incorporating victim support animals. The statistical data was undeniable. Children interviewed with support animals showed 71% higher disclosure rates compared to traditional procedures. Re-traumatization symptoms were significantly reduced. Most importantly, conviction rates in cases involving child victims had increased by 43% since implementation of the protocols. Detective had retired from active law enforcement but remained deeply involved in victim advocacy work. He'd become a consultant for police departments nationwide, training handlers in victim support protocols and advising prosecutors on trauma-informed interviewing techniques. His book had gone into its 5th printing. He received invitations to speak at law schools, universities, and professional conferences weekly. But perhaps his greatest satisfaction came from the letters he received from prosecutors and social workers describing cases where children had found their voices because of approaches developed from Emma's case. Officer had been promoted to sergeant and now oversaw a K-9 unit that had expanded from 3 dogs to 17. Duke, Emma's therapy dog, had retired from active service at age 11, spending his final years in the home of Officer and his family, a beloved family pet who'd played an extraordinary role in legal history. A new generation of dogs was being trained in victim support protocols, each one potentially helping traumatized children access their own truth. Judge had become a national figure in criminal justice reform. She'd been invited to testify before Congress about trauma-informed approaches to victim testimony. She'd keynoted major judicial conferences. Her courtroom had become a model facility that judges from across the country visited to observe procedures and learn implementation strategies. She'd received multiple awards for her innovative approach to justice, but she always credited Emma. "This wasn't my innovation," she would say in speeches. "This was a child's courage forcing us to do better." Sarah Mitchell, the child advocate, had written a book about her experiences working with traumatized children. The book included Emma's story, with permission and identifying details protected, and provided practical guidance for other advocates working with young victims. She'd transitioned from casework to training, developing curriculum for a national certification program in trauma-informed advocacy. Thousands of advocates had been trained using protocols she developed with Emma's case as the foundational model. Dr. Michael Torres had become one of the leading child trauma specialists in the country. He'd been recruited to develop treatment protocols for a major children's hospital. His work had influenced how pediatric psychiatry approached trauma recovery. He still remembered Emma's first silent sessions and her gradual emergence from silence into healing. He used her case in training materials for other therapists, always emphasizing that healing was possible, that trauma didn't have to define a life. The American legal system had fundamentally shifted in response to Emma's case. Law schools now routinely taught trauma-informed approaches in their criminal procedure courses. Police academies included victim support animal training in their standard curriculum. Child welfare agencies revised their protocols to incorporate lessons learned from Emma's experience. The system that had originally moved so slowly to protect her had been forced to evolve and improve. But perhaps most significantly, Emma's case had given voice to hundreds of other children. Prosecutors reported that after implementation of the Emma Protocol, more child victims came forward with disclosures. The presence of therapy animals in courtrooms became normalized, expected, essential. Other traumatized children saw Emma's story and recognized that they too could speak, could be heard, could find justice. At age 8, Emma didn't fully understand the scope of her impact. She knew her story had become famous. She understood that her testimony had led to her father's imprisonment. She recognized that other children were helped by approaches that grew from what she'd experienced. But mostly, Emma was focused on being a normal child. School, friendships, art class, the upcoming science fair project she was planning with her friend Sophie, had chosen to allow Emma gradually increasing access to information about her own case as she matured. At 4, she'd explained simply that Emma had been hurt and that speaking up had helped keep her safe. At 6, Emma had asked more detailed questions and had answered age-appropriately. By 8, Emma was old enough to understand broader concepts about her case's impact, though remained protective of her granddaughter's privacy. And one day, Emma asked her grandmother, "Why did that dog help me when I was scared? Why couldn't words come out?" Sat beside her granddaughter and explained in language Emma could understand. When we're very scared, our bodies get stuck in that scared feeling. Our brains have trouble remembering words or using them. But when we feel safe, when we know someone or something cares about us and won't let us get hurt, our bodies start to relax. And when our bodies relax, our brains can work again. Duke helped your body relax so your brain could work. Emma nodded thoughtfully. "I want to help other children who are scared," she said. "How can I do that?" Smiled. In many ways, Emma was already helping other children simply by allowing her story to be shared, simply by demonstrating that speaking truth had been the right choice, simply by living her life as a thriving survivor rather than a broken victim. That summer took Emma to the local animal shelter. The girl had expressed interest in volunteering and had helped her secure a volunteer position appropriate for her age. Emma spent Saturday mornings helping care for rescue dogs, brushing their coats, playing with them in the yard, learning about their needs and personalities. She gravitated toward the scared dogs, the ones that flinched at loud noises or cringed at unexpected movement. She would sit quietly with them, petting them gently, offering the kind of patient presence that she'd learned from Duke. "You have a special gift with the frightened ones," the shelter director told. "Emma seems to understand what they need." Perhaps thought that was the truest legacy. Emma had learned that safety could be created, that presence mattered, that sometimes the most powerful thing one being could offer another was simply to exist without judgment or demand. Whether working with traumatized dogs or living her own life as a healed survivor, Emma was teaching others what she'd learned in the most painful way possible. 5 years later, as a teenager, Emma would volunteer at crisis counseling centers. At 16, she would give her first public speech about her experience. At 18, she would begin studying psychology in college, driven by a desire to help other children who'd experienced trauma. But at 8 years old, she was simply a girl who'd been hurt, who'd found her voice, and whose courage had inadvertently changed the landscape of American justice. The Emma Protocol had become standard. Trauma-informed approaches were now assumed rather than innovative. Child victim testimony had been revolutionized, and it had all begun because one small child, with the help of a gentle dog, had found the courage to point at her abuser and speak the truth that would set her free.